Welcome to the show. I'm so excited for our discussion today. We're going to talk about replace, reduce, and remake a framework for innovating with sweeteners. I'm Annalee Witte. I'm your host. And today I'm joined by Innovation Advisor Micaela Cox. Yeah. Do you want to introduce yourself, Micaela?
Yeah, of course. Thanks so much for having me, Annalee. Excited to be here. Yeah, a little bit about myself. So I have had a passion for nutrition, wellness, all things health for quite a while from a pretty young age. But in college, I realized that I could actually pursue that interest in nutrition through the lens of food science, which led me to major in food science and nutrition, obviously. And then I had the opportunity through my PhD to kind of study at the intersection of the two. So fascinating space to learn about. And since joining the Innovation Advisors team, I've been able to carry that passion and interest forward through working with a variety of different product developers and nutritionists, leaders, innovation leaders within a lot of food and ag companies that we work with. So it's been a joy to kind of work in the space and continue that passion through the work we do. Yeah.
Definitely. So as a food scientist, and because you're doing all of these different projects around sweeteners and sugar, what are your thoughts on all the investment going into this space? Why is this happening?
Yeah, great question. So first of all, I'll have to say, sweetener innovation, sugar reduction, replacement, and so on is certainly not a new thing. We've been pursuing that for a very long time at this point, but there's definitely different iterations of that we see throughout the industry. And I think the latest wave of innovation and increase in investment is really stemming from slightly different motives than we've seen in the past. To no one's surprise, as we're seeing these motives across multiple industries, across other facets of the food industry itself. Health and sustainability are the two predominant factors driving a lot of that new innovation, pursuit of new sweet molecules. And so, yeah, we're really seeing a lot in way of that, lots of upcycled sweeteners, so sweeteners that are being derived from waste streams of other products being produced, and so on. And so there's really a lot happening in the space because of that pursuit of nutrition and sustainability and environmental health. So.
Gotcha. That's really interesting. So you say pursuit of new sweet molecules, and that's really interesting to me. And I think that leads us to our first R, replace. So what are the most popular sweeteners, and why the need to replace certain sweeteners all of a sudden?
Yeah, for sure. So a lot of consumers, they think of sweeteners and they think of the different colored packets that you see when you go to a restaurant, or you're putting some sweetener in your coffee. So you have your equals, your sweet and lows, your Splendas, your stevia now, which is kind of the natural green packet, if you will. That's what a lot of consumers think about, but really the sweet molecules extend far beyond just those couple of compounds that we see on a day-to-day basis in restaurants. So there's tons of different classes of sweet molecules. Historically and most predominantly, people are familiar with the artificial sweeteners, but now we're finding stevias and a lot of new natural sweeteners that are emerging, and we're working on their commercialization and they're growing their use within market and within products. So,
yeah. So maybe you can say more about artificial sweeteners versus natural sweeteners. It seems like there's a lot of different stuff going on. Sure. Maybe natural sweeteners are getting a little bit more popular right now.
Absolutely.
Could you just talk about the distinction a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. So artificial sweeteners, there's a lot of scrutiny, to no one's surprise. Everyone's pretty aware of this at this point. A lot of scrutiny around some of those artificial sweeteners that have been used for several decades at this point. And so an example of this is aspartame. Not too long ago, we saw a news article come out that the WHO said aspartame is not safe to consume. A couple weeks later, we see the FAO coming out and saying, well, when you're consuming aspartame at the adequate daily intake levels, it causes no harm. It's fine to consume. You have Harvard commenting on this. Then you have the FTC that is coming after food manufacturers and organizations that are paying influencers to advertise for aspartame, right? So the world is very confusing and complex. And all of these voices are causing a variety of different opinions and thus actions from consumers. And in large part, it's making consumers want to move away from these artificial sweeteners, which we've been doing for some time, but there's just increasing pressure to do so. And so we're really looking to alternatives now to these artificial sweeteners just because of a lot of the growing research and scrutiny around them.
So if I wanted to move away from some of these artificial sweeteners, what solutions should I consider if I am, working for a food or beverage manufacturer? Like, how do you think about switching those out?
Oh, yeah, good question. So when you think about swapping out one sweetener for another, which is, I think, what you're asking, there's a lot of considerations. Sugar itself has a lot of attributes that are difficult to replace. It's not only the sweetness intensity that you think about, but it's also the actual flavor profile when you experience that spike in sweetness. It's the bulking and the mouthfeel. It's the browning associated with sugar in some products. And so there's a lot of factors to consider just based off of its function. Sweeteners attempt to replace some or all of these functions, and sometimes a sweetener is combined with another ingredient to replace sugar and its whole functionality in a product. In addition to that, you have other physiochemical properties like stability or solubility. If you're heating this sugar in a product, or the sweetener in a product, you want to make sure it's stable and not degrading throughout that process, so that it is in the finished product as you want it to be and functions in that way. You have caloric content. Are you trying to create a diabetic friendly product, right? That's something to consider. You have suppliers, right? A lot of the food manufacturers that are wanting to replace sweeteners or replace sugars are needing a certain amount, a certain volume of this sweetener, and if it's only a small company that's producing this, they may not have the volume needed to actually meet the manufacturer's needs. And so there's so many details, and what we've done to assist our clients in this decision-making process is we've drafted what I would say is a very massive database, knowledge matrix, if you will, of all this information that details all of the new alternatives to these artificial sweeteners that may be of interest to these manufacturers as we look to what's available today and then what may be on the market in the next couple of years, and we provide all of this detailed information to help them sift through which molecule may be of most interest to them, which one suits their needs or meets the functionality of a given product. And then I would say, of course, I haven't mentioned health and sustainability. Those are obviously two of the major factors associated with choosing a new sweetener today. What is the environmental implications of this sweetener? What are the potential negative health consequences of consuming it? And so those are obviously massive components of making those decisions. So
yeah, so it's really complicated. It's
very
really hard.
complicated.
It's not super easy. Got it.
Yeah.
Tell me about some of the sweeteners you have found during your work that you think are interesting, that are maybe like on the cutting edge. Just like a few examples.
Definitely. So there's a lot, again, of growth in this space, a lot of new, interesting innovations coming about. But I would point to a recent molecule that just received FDA GRAS status this year, braisine. It's a sweet protein, and braisine is not the only sweet protein that has been discovered. There's a lot of other sweet protein molecules that I think we may see in the near future. But braisine is certainly interesting because it is a sweet protein. There's potentially advantages for its production and for its health implications because it is a protein. There's another class of compounds I'll also highlight here, rare sugars. So rare sugars aren't actually like a new discovery. Rare sugars are what they sound like. They're found in very rare amounts or small amounts in nature.
I love when something's what it sounds like.
Right, exactly.
So rare
it's very helpful. It's very helpful. So yeah, braisine is rare sugars are, they were discovered a long time ago, found in small amounts in fruits and vegetables that we commonly consume. And they were discovered by this professor at Kagawa University, Dr. Izumori, and he developed a process of converting these rare sugars called Izumori. It was named after him. So anyway, that's been around and known for a long time, but that process isn't necessarily super cost effective. There hasn't been maybe the demand there until more recently, and so we're starting to see these rare sugars actually enter the market now. due to some new processing methods that make it more feasible. And so allulose is a prime example of this. You may or may not heard of it, slowly making its way into the market. Tagatose is following allulose, and I think we may see some more in the near future. So those are just a couple. I'll maybe also add, it's a fascinating time because of the advent of AI, right? So
yes.
AI being leveraged in various discovery platforms to identify new molecules from new sources, places that we haven't looked for these sweet molecules before, becomes a lot faster of a process. And so I think that in the near future, we'll see perhaps a lot more in light of discovery of these new compounds. So we'll see. Stay tuned.
That's super interesting. What isn't AI changing?
Right.
So backing up just a little bit, you said something to consider is health and like the type of product you're trying to create. So what are the health implications for replacing with these new sweetener alternatives? What's the state of the science? Can you say it in just a few minutes?
How much time do we have? Yeah, so that is a big question. I've already alluded to the fact there's so many voices, and I would say some of them are based in science, some of them are not, and so it's a very confusing space. But if I could, I guess, summarize this at a very high level in a relatively short amount of time, I'd say that, historically we've reviewed, we've done toxicology analysis, we've done research to understand the health implications of these sweeteners, and they are granted as safe and safe to consume by FDA and received GRAS status and so on, based off of some of these studies. However, last 15 to 20 years, we've started to learn new things about the human body that haven't necessarily been taken into account in some of the earlier studies, right? So the gut microbiome is a huge component, right? So previously we assumed that you consume a sweetener and it passes through your body unmetabolized, or at least some of them do, and thus there's no impact on your body. However, you can actually consume a sweetener. Maybe it's unmetabolized by you yourself. You don't absorb it in your small intestine, but then it gets to your gut, and the microbes in your gut can actually metabolize that molecule, creating metabolites, then creating downstream health implications, or changing the population composition of your gut microbiome, right? So there's a lot of factors that haven't been considered in some of those earlier studies, and so this is certainly coming into question a lot more in light of various sugar sweeteners that we consume. And then the other thing to add here is also relatively recently, last 10 years or so, it was discovered that what we call taste receptors, G-coupled protein receptors, are found throughout the rest of the body. And so we know that when consuming a sweetener, you can actually trick your taste buds to think, oh, like I'm consuming sugar, when you're actually consuming a different molecule. But we don't necessarily know yet, can you trick the taste receptor in your stomach? Does it do anything differently by comparison to consuming sugar? Should it do something differently in terms of regulating hormones and metabolic processes, right? And so there's a lot of questions.
Yes, I have so many questions.
Okay, I'll summarize here. I know I could go on forever, but there's really two camps to land in, right? And so the first one is to say there is no strong scientific evidence to suggest that consuming these sweeteners today is harmful for my health, right? There's no really strong body of evidence to say that. The other camp is, well, we don't know enough yet to say that these sweeteners are healthy for us to consume. And so really it's a personal preference which camp you end up in. But I think that a lot of this kind of uncertainty and still unanswered questions lead some people to want to just reduce sugars or reduce sweetener consumption as well. And so I think that might lead us to maybe the second
that's a great
section of this.
segue. I am going to hold on to taste receptors in that conversation, and we'll come back to that because I think there's a lot to unpack there. But
for sure.
Yeah, so we've discussed replaced is an option, reduction is another option, so that's our second R. So let's get into that. I think we all know that Americans are just famous for our sweet tooth. There are formulations of products in the United States that are known to be sweeter than they are in other geographies. So when we talk about reducing sugar, are we talking about strategies to adapt to the American palate to just kind of turn down the knob and trick us?
Yeah, great question. That is certainly part of it. I would say there's definitely organizations that are making strategic plans in this way to slowly dial back the amount of sugar or the sweetness intensity of a given product over a given period of time, such that we as consumers would barely even notice or not notice at all. That is definitely one strategy, but a lot of times when organizations are talking about sugar reduction, they're talking about changing your perception of sweetness. So actually reducing sugar, reducing sweetener, but enhancing your perception to think they didn't change the amount that you're consuming at all. So that space is what's really fascinating to me.
Yes, yes. So we're talking about tricking our brains into thinking something is sweeter than it is. So I'm thinking
Basically,
here we're
yeah.
going to go back to the taste receptors.
Yeah.
So tell me more about this. So
Yeah,
there
yeah.
are taste receptors on our tongue that pick up sweetness,
Yep.
may or may not be sugar, easily tricked, but our stomachs also have these receptors and may not be so easily tricked.
Yeah. So it's a wild world, taste receptors. If you're asking about how we actually trick these taste receptors, I'm gonna say keep the discussion about the taste receptors on your tongue. We don't know yet what the taste receptors in your gut do.
That's unexplored.
We'll get there eventually.
We just found those.
We'll get there eventually. But the taste receptors on your tongue, there's a variety of different ways we can like trick you into thinking. And I shouldn't use the word trick. We're not trying to be deceptive, but we're trying to work for your good, reduce the amount of sugar you're actually consuming. And there's a variety of ways to do that. So the first one I'll call out is I guess associated with sugar localization in a product, right? So if you're consuming certain products, maybe it's a chocolate bar, maybe it's something else, the density of the sugar in relation to where it hits on your tongue matters, right? So if you think about okay, if you could have more sugar in the location of that product where it's going to come in contact with my tongue and less sugar in the portion of the product where it's not actually going to interact with my tongue, then I can optimize the amount of sugar, reduce it, but it would still taste like I had an equal density localization of sugar throughout that product. A crazy concept, I know.
That's insane.
But people are playing around with this. Nestle actually worked on this several years ago, released a product called Nestle Wowsums, and they called it hollow sugar. So it was playing off of this concept. It's no longer on the market, but others have pursued this same general concept and other companies since then. So very, very interesting route. There's also sweetener synergies, I guess you could say. There's the concept that consuming one sweetener with another sweetener actually enhances the total perception of sweetness. So it's not 1 + 1 = 2, but 1 + 1 = 3, basically. So you often see, I believe it's ACE and aspartame combined together in products, and that is the reason for that. It enhances that sweetness perception.
Gotcha.
There's a couple others if you want me to keep going. There's a...
Well, I'm curious.
Yeah.
We just discussed enhancing sweetness perception, but what about reducing sweetness perception? Is that also possible?
Oh, yeah. So, yes, in order to explain that, I might need to explain one other concept of...
I'm ready. Hit me with it.
Are you sure?
Yes,
This is we're going to go on a little ride here. Okay, so there is a means of enhancing, modulating taste, modulating your sweet perception via leveraging certain molecules that interact with your taste receptors a little differently than a sweetener does. So we're going to go back to biology 101. You have your enzyme, your lock and key model. So your sweetener is actually the key, right, that locks into the active site of that enzyme.
Okay.
Right. But in some cases, molecules can actually bind to another portion of that enzyme, changing the conformation of the active site such that when that sweetener binds, it can enhance or perhaps decrease your perception of sweetness. So one major area of taste modulation science is in these what are called positive allosteric modulators. So there's a ton of research in this space actually stemming from the pharmaceutical industry. How do we enhance the perception of sweeteners with these positive allosteric modulators? And so when you ask the question of can you actually downregulate your perception of sweetness, the answer is yes, because there's also negative allosteric modulators, which is fascinating, but they work a little bit differently. There's a company called Sweet Victory that just released, maybe not just released, a little while ago, released a chewing gum actually, that leverages a compound called gymnema extract. And it is a negative allosteric modulator that when you consume this gum, it actually suppresses your sweet tooth, if you will, for a couple of hours. And so that is what these negative allosteric modulators do, which is just fascinating to me.
That is so interesting.
Yeah.
Is there any connection between negative allosteric modulators and like GLP-1 or Ozempic type drugs? That just sounds like a similar function to me.
Yep, great question, timely question. No.
Okay.
But
different.
Great question.
Yes.
Very different mechanism of action. But it is, on that note, GLP-1 and the research coming out around that and the implications for consumers taking GLP-1 drugs, as well as the implications for the food industry, right? I think it will be fascinating when we consider the world of sweeteners in tandem with GLP-1 consumers as we look to the future. So there's some research coming out that consuming GLP-1 drugs obviously suppresses your appetite, but also reduces your desire for highly sweet and highly fatty foods. And if that research evolves, and if we have 9-10% of the population on GLP-1 drugs, how does that change the relative sweetness that we are pursuing in the products we're making, or the level of sugar that we're consuming. So I think it'll be interesting to track that and see how maybe the world of sugars and sweeteners evolves alongside it.
Big changes in the future.
For sure.
That's so interesting. Okay, so we went on a journey with
did.
reduce. We've covered replace, we've covered reduce. Let's move to the last avenue, remake. Tell me, what does remake mean? What does that word really mean?
Yes. When we say remake here, I think we're talking really about how are we making these sugar molecules or sweet molecules? And so historically, right, you can find a plant native or natural plant, you can extract a sweet molecule that you find in that plant and then put it in a product, consume it. But in a lot of cases, that actually is not the most sustainable means of producing that sweet molecule. For instance, monk fruit is found in a small region in southern China. If we were to only make monk fruit from harvesting it from those plants, it would not be very sustainable. The logistics of shipping that around the world would be very energy intensive, right? And so remake is really about what are the alternative means of making these sweet molecules in a sustainable and of course healthy way. So yeah.
Gotcha. Okay, so you just mentioned sustainability, and we've talked about sustainability a little bit. What is the sweetener industry doing to improve sustainability, and how does that connect to remaking?
Yeah. Definitely. So a lot of sustainability is related to the process of producing these sweet molecules, perhaps not to your surprise. But when we talk about this, the processes that are actually being leveraged and considered, precision fermentation, bulk fermentation, these are the ones that come to mind first, of course. We're seeing this transform a lot of industries right now. How can you leverage fermentation to produce molecules in perhaps a more sustainable way? I do think we need more LCA analysis, but precision fermentation, bulk fermentation is definitely one of the means of producing these sweet molecules in an alternative fashion. Enzymatic technologies, not new, but certainly being leveraged to do this as well. We've seen a lot of partnerships among suppliers and people that have enzymatic technology platforms to produce these sweeteners in a way that's a little bit more cost-effective or less energy intensive in some cases. And then the third one is a little bit perhaps newer to the food industry, newer to the sugar industry. It's called two things. If you're a scientist, you're going to call it synthetic biology. Okay. If you're talking to a consumer, you're going to say molecular farming, which is a just fun term.
Yes.
Molecular farming. Molecular farming is really about taking a plant that maybe doesn't natively produce the sweet molecule, but leveraging that to manufacture, but in a natural plant organism, the molecule of interest.
Okay.
And so there's some companies playing in this space right now that are really doing some interesting things. So.
Gotcha. Wow. So
Lots
you're
going
using a plant as a tiny manufacturing process
exactly
to extract the sweetener that you want.
I love that explanation. Yes.
That's so cool.
Yeah,
wow.
There's actually a company just down the road from here, Elo Life, that is working on this now. They are working to grow monk fruit in a watermelon, and I believe hoping to launch in 2026. So we'll see. But very excited to see their process and hopefully see that come to market soon.
Wow, that's really cool. Interesting. Well, if they're just down the road, we might have to talk to them.
I know.
We'll have to see what happens.
For sure.
So you mentioned a player like Elo Life. Who else is in this space? Who's working on some of these like novel methods?
Yeah. How much time do I have? So there's a ton of players, obviously. We've done a lot of work with our clients mapping the space for them to say, okay, here's the startups, here's the academics that are supporting the research, here's suppliers, here's the partnerships that are being leveraged to actually commercialize and produce some of these. And a lot of times partnerships are very helpful for changing the production method of these sweet molecules, right? So there's a ton of players in this space, too many to mention right now, but I'll name a couple. One is Fooditive. They recently have just launched their product in the US. So it was somewhere international previously, but they are now producing their 5 keto fructose, which is unique because it is upcycled. They have like an apple waste stream that they're leveraging to actually produce this 5 keto fructose sweetener molecule. And so, lots of exciting work in the upcycling space, not just from food additive, but many others. And then I would say there's a lot of other startups playing in the precision fermentation space, of course. Amai Proteins is one that comes to mind just off the top of my head. They have worked on several sweet protein molecules, as I mentioned earlier, and just launched one called Sweeteners. It's not a natural compound, but it's inspired by nature, if you will, and they're making that through precision fermentation. So lots of activity. Yeah.
I can tell how well versed you are in this. I'm so impressed by how many you could just name off the top of your head. How can we keep a pulse on what's next for Sweeteners? How can we be like you? How can we know this information?
Yeah,
Where do you look to know this?
Yeah, so lots of deep dives in the literature, lots of hours spent reading some papers, but a lot of IP analysis as well. We do a deep investigation of the IP literature just to keep a pulse on what's happening and also to have a better understanding of like what is actually of interest and actively being pursued. There's a ton of sweet molecules that have been identified, but for various reasons won't ever make it to the commercial market. And so we help distinguish some of those things through the resources that we leverage, like IP, literature, and more. We also get on the phone with people and just talk to them firsthand, understand more about what's happening in the space and the probability of certain molecules actually being commercialized. So, yeah.
Wow. I don't know that that's approachable for, like one person to do. So if somebody was, take a team. If somebody was wondering, how do they work with you?
Yeah.
How do they talk to you about this? What would be the best way for them to reach out to you?
Absolutely. There's a variety of ways. I would say reach out to me on LinkedIn, email me. Any of those personal communications are totally great. But we also have the RTI Innovation Advisors website that you can reach out to. There's like a contact form there. If you're interested in learning more about our company and or working with us, we will definitely respond to those messages as well. So.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing all of the knowledge that you've gained from working on these projects and your background in the food science industry. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.